We have a wonderful panel, and we look forward to your contribution to the discussion as well. I'm going to introduce, we're going to take our panelists' discussion, and then after they've all presented, we'll have questions and discussion from the floor. So our first speaker is Maga Miranda. She was an organizer with the International Women's Strike in New York City. Her Marxist feminist study areas include critical theory and Chicana theory. Magda.
Thanks. I should also mention I'm a member of Red Bloom, which is a communist collective in New York City. I forgot to mention that, but yeah. So in the weeks leading up to the March 8th International Women's Strike, many in the liberal and even left media were critical of the strike action. On the one hand, liberal feminists like Sadie Doyle argued that a women's strike could only have been conceived in the minds of the most privileged women. Many on the left also questioned the efficacy of strikes as a political tactic rather than one rooted more squarely within shop floor concerns like wages or working conditions. Organizing for March 8th continued in spite of these criticisms, which I won't address in detail in this talk, but which I and other comrades have addressed in other forums. Thousands of women across the globe struck on the day of. We in the United States found ourselves also defending the call for a strike, which we had taken up but had not been called by us, but was called by international. We were calling for international solidarity over and against American chauvinism. After all, the first people to call the strike were international contacts in places like Poland and Argentina, where a total ban on abortion and the issue of feminicides, respectively, had galvanized masses of women to hit the streets months earlier. Of the women who participated in actions on the day of, most relied primarily on grassroots power rather than celebrity, mainstream political endorsements, or even, for the most part, organized labor. Concerns varied between countries and cities, as did the composition of participants. But one thing that was shared across the globe was that the movement was, quote, by and for women who have been marginalized and silenced by decades of neoliberalism. In the United States, the National Committee pursued the slogan of a feminism for the 99% to indicate the working class character of our brand of feminism. The slogan of feminism for the 99% here sought on the one hand to displace bourgeois feminism, to be an alternative of sorts to the imperialist feminism of the pantsuit nation put on offer by the Hillary Clinton presidency. Oh, sorry. Give me a sec. By the Hillary Clinton presidency. The so-called lean-in feminism exalted by bourgeois women like Sheryl Sandberg had proven time and time again to be incompatible with the demands of working-class women workers. Girl bosses, she-os, and boss feminism proved time and time again that sisterhood between bosses and workers breaks down when profits are to be made from our exploitation. See the lawsuits against Nasty Gal and Thinks, for example. Taking aim at Clinton in the book False Choices, the Faux Feminism of Hillary Rodham Clinton, Liza Featherstone, and company discuss the limitations of trickle-down feminism. What good is having a woman president if she's an imperialist warmonger who thinks black youth are super predators and continues to slash welfare services? Wall Street's candidate is not our candidate, no matter her gender. Alongside providing a critique of bourgeois feminism, the slogan of feminism for the 99% represents an orientation towards working class feminism. Programmatically, this has meant articulating wherever possible what we've called a broad social coalition, capable of capturing a cross-section of grassroots organization and the left wing of labor movements. Interestingly enough, a not insignificant percentage of participants on March 8th were also individuals who showed up in pink pussy hats, looking for a feminism beyond the Clinton campaign and the Democrat-friendly Women's March that took place following the inauguration. In the U.S., this has meant consolidating a layer of already left-leaning as well as of individuals as well, most notably scholars and professors of various socialist and Marxist orientations, and engaging precarious workers like those who work at the domestic worker centers in the nation's large urban cores and are organized under groups like the National Domestic Workers Alliance. who participated on the day of. Ajin Poo, director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, wrote that members of the alliance would be participating by wearing red, and that there would be mixed participations in terms of work stoppage. Not everyone who participated was a self-proclaimed socialist, communist, or even a leftist, but March 8th has worked towards articulating a broad social coalition of women united under a generally anti-capitalist program. Nationally in the United States, marches, rallies, and other events were held in over 50 cities and towns to honor the strike and agitate for a new movement of women and femmes, cis and trans working women. The call for a day without a woman was taken up internationally and by diverse women in solidarity against marginalization, gendered violence, and factory floor concerns. Hundreds of thousands joined not only in New York City, but also in Chicago, Oakland, San Francisco, where protesters plan to shut down an ICE office, Ann Arbor, where marchers set up a picket line in front of the governor's residence, and other cities. Rallies and marches also took place in major cities outside the U.S. like Mexico City, Rome, Warsaw, and more. The social, political, and economic concerns of demonstrators varied too. In San Salvador, El Salvador, transgender women and their allies took the lead, and in Melbourne, Australia, 1,000 childcare workers walked out of their jobs. Importantly, the strike on March 8th didn't just consist of workers who were already left activists, as I said earlier, and it didn't just amount to another march. Everywhere you looked on social media and IRL in real life, women and their supporters were visibly decked out in red clothing for the day, making a strong visual statement. In some places, the strike closed offices and places of work. School districts in North Carolina and Virginia closed down because so many workers called out sick from work, and as did the Providence courthouse. March 8th showed why strikes are necessary. Speakers on the main stage at the rally in New York City's Washington Square drew connections between increasing pressures on women, falling wages, rising rents, and a lack of access to health care. From street violence to domestic violence and police violence, from the occupation of Palestine and U.S. wars abroad to the water protectors at Standing Rock and the water crisis in Flint. Just as the feminism of the 99% draws out such connections between terrains of struggle, strikes, walkouts, and other tactics of workplace disruption help bring to light the connection between our work life and home life and the undue burden placed on women who often have to do the lion's share of both. There's incredible power in demonstrating as workers and members of the community, and women are uniquely placed to do so. Just as the connections between IWS organizers in over 30 countries highlights the shared experience of women and workers around the world, thinking about, talking through, and taking a break from women's work has helped demonstrate the shared experiences of women, paid and unpaid, across a range of jobs. March 8th also showed that walkouts can work, and sometimes better than we might think. Harder to see are the conversations women had at work or about work. In this way, movement work mirrors the work of social reproduction, which is unpaid and often invisibilized. There is something valuable, however, about bringing together workers in traditional unions like the New York State Nurses Association and the local of the American Federation of Teachers that represents faculty at CUNY, with worker centers, newer unions, and workplace organizations like the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union. It's hard to measure the effect of these conversations people had on the day of, or the work of building a movement that replaces the work that we do for the boss when we strike. So as I've described, the strike tactic has been proven to be a controversial one, but one that I'm convinced women and all workers must build in the coming years. It's often noted that the unionization rate has been declining for years. Less often spoken about is the rate of workplace actions and disruptions measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The rate of strike actions has declined by 90% since 1977, with 2016 representing the lowest strike rate yet, despite a large and successful strike by Verizon workers. The first International Working Women's Day in 1909 was the catalyst for struggles that won many of the labor protections workers enjoy today, and the women's strike took steps to revive it as a commonplace and common sense tactic by confronting an American political imagination that doesn't see the strike as necessary, effective, or even possible. I'm convinced that we have a lot to learn in this regard from the political subjectivities that have emerged out of the domestic workers' movements, for example, and it'll be crucial to connect these struggles against interpersonal violence for an end to exploitation, against U.S. imperialism, and for a radical reorganization of society that will make the hopes and aspiration of immigrant women a reality in our future. Organized domestic workers have been active in recent years, including but not limited to participating in the 2016 Day Without an Immigrant Strike, demonstrating against Donald Trump's inauguration, participating in local labor struggles and actions against police violence, and border struggles of various kinds. Mainstream as well as left media have given credence to the efforts of institutions like Catholic churches and Latinx radio stations in mobilizing large demonstrations, and they certainly have played a role, but largely ignored the complex grassroots networks whose core is Latina immigrant women workers. Women involved in immigrant strikes have spent years building worker centers that not only provide support for those combating rights violations at work, but provide legal support and education and host community events. The idea behind this strategy is that social isolation enables the exploitation of their labor. Community building in these centers embolden women workers to demand a more fair share of the value they produce, better conditions, and a life worth living. All of these activities provide the foundations for the kinds of confidence and solidarity that enable women's mobilization. Smaller mobilizations and community building activities in turn build the networks needed to raise those actions to the level of the general strike, where, quote, all the workers in every industry in a country, or perhaps in every country, cease work, to quote Frederick Engels. We see this in the case of teachers participating in March 8th, who are also union members and advocates for better education. Strikers and organizers are making use of the networks and organizations they are already part of to build the strike, and making use of the strike to build those connections. We're only just now grazing the surface with regards to the lessons we can learn from this struggle, which is not merely a sectoral struggle. As Silvia Federici reminds us, capitalism not only requires, quote, an immense quantity of unpaid domestic activity for the reproduction of the workforce, but also engages in the devaluation of these reproductive activities with the aim of reducing the cost of the labor force in general. This analysis makes it possible to see feminist movements against the gender division of labor and for bodily autonomy as part of a broader struggle to undermine capital's capacity for exploitation. Women's resistance is central to the struggles both at work and in neighborhoods. As Patrick Cunningham recounts, this recognition in 1970s Italy opened up the possibility of a broad range of struggles on the terrain of social reproduction, including auto reduction campaigns, rent strikes, student movements, and movements of the unemployed. The mantra of the Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights, for example, that women workers make all other work possible, is a nod to those movements, gesturing to the sorts of paid and unpaid work of women that undergird capitalist society and whose refusal has the potential to shut down capitalism if the moment called for it. So I have a couple more things to say, but I want to draw out 2 points about the struggle of immigrant women workers that are related to the International Women's Strike and can inform our class politics writ large. First, I want to make a point about periodization. It's safe to say that many theorists on the left today have tended to situate the current period of struggle beginning with the financial crisis of 2009. Surely doing so is useful as it helps us think together movements like Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring, or electoral movements like Syriza and Podemos. On the other hand, I want to suggest that it's impossible to discuss International Women's Strike or the Day Without a Woman without situating it within a different and perhaps related genealogy, but a few years earlier in 2006, when the Day Without an Immigrant political strike shut down urban cores like Los Angeles and Chicago and struck a blow at xenophobic policies in a massive way. Not only is it accurate given the circumstances to do this, but I believe it's a useful practice of remembering that our struggles are not only a response to the crises of capital, but from above, but are also people's histories from below. I think an adequate place to start the discussion about how International Women's Day has shaped class politics is to retrace the debates within Marxism in which it's intervening. It's often common sense for Marxists that the defining feature of capitalism as a mode of production is that it organizes social relations around the commodity form through a process of valorization and the exploitation of workers through the wage. Hence, shop floor concerns have played a central role in the ways we articulate class struggle on the left. Importantly, Marxist feminists, the ones I'm concerned with at least, have given a name to those activities that take place outside of the point of production or the terrain of social reproduction. In short, social reproduction theorists use Marxism to theorize that which was under-theorized by Marx and even Engels, though Engels obviously attempted to write about the family and the capitalist mode of production. In any case, what's useful about social reproduction theory is that in naming the unpaid and often underpaid work of feminized people, it helps us map the terrain on which feminized workers exist and intervene in relation to the capitalist mode of production. Nancy Fraser, in her fantastic essay on contradictions of capital and care, usefully reminds us that the terrain of production and reproduction are constantly shifting along with crisis, and that we're living under a regime currently of what she calls globalizing financialized capitalism. This regime, Fraser writes, has relocated manufacturing to low-wage regions, recruited women into the paid workforce, and promoted state and corporate divestment from social welfare. Externalizing care work onto families and communities, it has simultaneously diminished their capacity to perform it. The result, amid rising inequality, is dualized organization of social reproduction, commodified for those who can pay for it, privatized for those who cannot, all glossed over by the even more modern ideal of the two-earner family. The social reproduction strike, then, and I argue its predecessor to the Day Without an Immigrant strike, must be situated within this framework of production and reproduction as a social totality. The so-called political strike is necessarily an expression of the class struggle on the terrain of social reproduction and production. How might we think about class struggle differently through this lens? I propose beginning with retelling the story of 2006. In 2006, millions of immigrants and their supporters took to the streets to push back against the xenophobic H.R. 4437, a law that would have criminalized undocumented people and anyone who helped them. Mobilizing thousands of workers, it was necessarily a movement concerned with issues at the point of production, but it was also concerned with the terrain of social reproduction in a very real way. We can imagine, and I know from experience that many of the people that were on strike that day remember the horrors of Proposition 187, where a 16-year-old boy and an elderly woman died rather than see a doctor at the hospital. They feared deportation more than death itself. Likewise, we should think about March 8th as a struggle against capital in its social totality at the point of production and social reproduction. Some of the most militant workers in our movement, those in the nursing union and nurses, help illustrate this point. Every year, time and time again, their main demand is for better staff-patient ratios. In some ways, we can think about this as a traditional labor struggle over working conditions, but this demand also necessarily reminds us that women workers and feminized workers will continue to be at the forefront of demanding a more just society that values lives more than bottom lines. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Anne Montague. Anne is a founder of the SEIU Service Employees International Union Lavender Caucus, a longtime leader, rank and file leader in the SEIU, and a member of Socialist Action.
Thanks. This is great. This is the second panel I've been to. All women is great. So for the last 4 decades, the working class worldwide has been suffering under a most cruel and brutal and sustained assault by the ruling classes of the world. To try to compensate for their falling rate of profit, the movers and shakers of the global capitalist system have determined to recoup their rate of return by the most extreme measures. In country after country, the rollback of hourly wages, working conditions, has been accompanied by dramatic cuts in social services, education, healthcare, childcare, elder care. That is a shift of costs and burden for all these necessities from the ruling classes to working women, and especially women of color, women without papers. This drive has been accompanied in many countries by the most extreme attacks on reproductive justice and reinforced by a popular political misogyny and rape culture. In most cases, the traditional leaderships of working class organizations, trade unions, the social democratic parties, have responded with a strategy of class collaboration, justification for the austerity measures, depriving their membership of even a chance of entering into the field of battle to defend their standard of living, or sometimes limiting the struggle to symbolic action that does not truly threaten the liberal capitalist parties to which they feel subservience. Socialists know that the solution to the impasse will come eventually from the emergence of new rank-and-file leaderships determined to fight in formations that allow them to outflank these misleaders and deploy the full might of the working class power. Winning some victories will inspire and instruct millions in class struggle politics. These rank-and-file formations must address the needs of those most victimized by the capitalist offensive, or they will fail. What will those formations look like? We have examples from history and a few contemporary examples. One thing that is absolutely clear is that those formations must project a vision of a future in which women, who are the anchor of child care, adult care, elder care, and in-home care of the sick and the disabled, will be leaders and their issues will be center stage. Excuse me. It is in this light that we have to see the recent round of global strikes and demonstrations by women. It is a new critical stage in the fight for women's liberation, but also providing some necessary conditions for the development of a broader working class fight back in country after country. On October 3rd of this year, the women of Poland went on strike against the ruling party, the right-wing Law and Justice Party. Among other things, does anyone have any water? I don't think I might.
I'll
If
go
not,
get some.
Oh,
Keep-
thanks, yeah.
Aren't you like a panelist?
Mhm.
I can get some.
Oh, thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you. Okay.
So the strike was against a right-wing government. I think that's really important. Among other things, this government was pushing a draconian abortion law that would force women to give birth. It included prison sentences of up to 5 years for any woman who terminates a pregnancy. There could be a formal investigation of any woman who had a miscarriage. The introduction of this bill sparked the largest movement for women's rights in Polish history. Polish women did not call for reforms to the bill. They called on women to strike. On that day, 7 million women throughout Poland turned out to defend their basic reproductive rights. Tens of thousands of women walked off the job. Students boycotted classes. 30,000 women dressed in black gathered at Warsaw's Castle Square and marched to Parliament, paralyzing traffic in the center of the city for 2 hours. The result was that the bill was permanently withdrawn by Parliament, and one of the organizers said of the victory, "Women will never be the same again." Let's imagine for one moment how this victory will impact the broader struggle for the Polish regime's brutal austerity drive. Clearly, this mobilization said something powerful to all the Polish workers who are trying to figure out how to respond to the new attacks of their standard of living. Surely a layer of these women are newly confident of their ability to mobilize others for all fights ahead. Their successful deployment of even modest work stoppages is a lesson rebounding around Eastern Europe, where capitalism is undertaking some of its meanest efforts to solve their crisis on the backs of working women. But this phenomenon was not restricted to Poland. Soon afterwards, the women of Ireland announced they would strike to protest their country's ban on abortion. The women had been building the strike for repeal movement that took up the call for a women's strike. And this is an important quote from them about their perspective. They said, "Strikes have proven effective in worker struggles as direct economic interventions, but social strikes have also had significant impacts. Similar to Iceland, we have put a focus on domestic labor in our calls for a strike, but we are aware of the difficulties involved in women taking strike action in all its various forms. So we've tried to be as inclusive and respectful of this reality as possible." This is something we were thinking about, so we put out a call for the strike with a number of options: not going to work, not doing domestic work, turning up at a protest, or wearing black. These last two were also used in Poland and opened the door to a more general civil disobedience, as well as what would normally be considered a strike. There has been a lot of discussion about women outside the traditional trade union structures using the term women's strike to describe mobilizations that at best are only partially anchored by workouts from work. But clearly these multifaceted actions were able to unite women from many backgrounds into a common force while not retreating from the understanding that in the end, organized worksite action must be central to any fundamental challenge to the capitalist offensive. The first major action of the second wave of U.S. feminism in 1970, of course, was called a women's strike for equity. In capitalist society, in capitalist society, women are essential to the system in both their role as wage labor and domestic labor. And any movement that will be successful, any movement that is determined to prevent the right from co-opting the frustration of women left in the home, must develop a strategy that unites women in a struggle to take on both exploitation and oppression. The major victory in Poland and ongoing struggles around the world propelled the women in, I don't know, I've heard 30 or 50 countries, to engage in militant activities on International Women's Day. In each case, some step toward a new women's movement of the 99% has been taken. In the US, even though our actions were modest in comparison, they raised consciousness about the type of women's movement that we need, and asserted boldly that this movement must be tied to working class struggles of all kinds against capitalist predations. Many new young women came to learn about the historic relationship of the goal of women's liberation to the worldwide socialist movement for workers' class power. Joining the ties between the movement for women's liberation and the understanding that replacing the capitalist system is crucial. So the fledgling effort in the US must be judged as an important step forward. In the United States, that had seen 4 million women take to the streets for women's rights and against Trump on January 21st, socialist feminists saw the need to make a new project visible. Casting the wide net at this moment of feminist interest and mobilization was necessary and right. The U.S. International Women's Strike Committee began to explain and popularize a feminism for the 99%. The organizing was directed towards women working inside and outside the home, women of color, Native women, immigrant women, lesbian and trans women. They clearly opposed economic inequality, racial and sexual violence, and imperial wars abroad. 30 cities and towns across the U.S. had actions organized around the platform of feminism for the 99%. Some rallies, some marches, some meetings. There were some strikes from work paid and unpaid. The most visible strikes were in school districts where there were so many women workers who were striking that the school districts closed the schools for the day. In North Carolina, the Chapel Hill Carrboro City Public Schools closed. Soon after their announcement, the superintendent of the Alexandria, Virginia, and the Maple Street School in New York City closed. In addition, 33 teachers at Baylor Taylor Elementary School in Philadelphia walked out to protest working for 4 years without a contract. It was impressive organizing that was done in the space of about 4 weeks. But one of the problems with organizing women's strikes in the U.S. is that so few women workers have ever been on strike. Not even an economic strike, much less a political strike. An anti-capitalist feminist movement that is addressing women's paid and unpaid work in relation to striking is urgent today. Over the last decade, as the capitalist class has imposed austerity measures on all workers, they have increased the double and triple burden on women workers. There is a major offensive to reduce the social wage, which is aimed directly at women. This attack is making women responsible for work that is stressful and unpaid, specifically child care, elder care, in-home health care. On top of unpaid work, women are often most often in contingent, irregular, temporary part-time, and contract labor. It is important that there have been recent union organizing campaigns for home care workers. But in the United States, unlike Canada, they have no right to strike under these contracts. Even these meager advances, like being covered by workers' compensation when they are injured on the job and being paid more than the minimum wage, are being attacked by the ruling class, with a major assault on the right of home care to have a union. I believe this is because they see this as an inroad into women starting to reject the whole idea that they are expected to accept.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. Take care.
What's about to happen?
So the idea, yeah. Where was I?
Take a deep breath from that.
Anyway, so this idea of unionizing home care, is they're attacking it so strongly because they're afraid that this is sort of like the beginning, right? The beginning of the fact that people who are expected to accept responsibility for elderly children, sick and injured, without pay, that this whole idea will spark thinking for other women. And women workers are affected, like the rest of the working class, by ongoing betrayal of union bureaucrats who make deals with management and ignore or suppress worker struggles. Historically, however, they have led heroic actions that transformed everything. In 1981, black women in Atlanta went on strike for higher pay. The strike began with 20 laundresses, who by the opposition called them 20 Amazons, created a group called the Washing Society, which determined what a fair wage should be. In 3 weeks of organizing, they grew to over 3,000. They called a mass meeting that voted to strike. Despite being arrested and fined, their strike inspired cooks and maids and hotel workers to also make demands. In the end, the wages of all black women workers in Atlanta were raised. Working women have often been the lead of actions that forced a recalcitrant union misleadership to take up the fight. In the 1909 clarion call for the famous Uprising of 20,000, which defied the male leadership of the needle trades and put tens of thousands of immigrant garment workers into the streets of New York, that was spoken and led by the young immigrant Clara Lemlich. In Bridgeport, Connecticut, in 1915, it was immigrant female teenagers organized by Hungarian socialist organizers who led the Bridgeport general strike of that year and won the 8-hour day for the 26,000 female strikers and the city as a whole. In the important rank-and-file efforts to put up a roadblock to the concession contracts of the 1980s in coal and meatpacking, mothers, sisters, and wives of strikers formed brigades and toured the nation to rally social support for the major class struggle challenge to corporations and the union bureaucracy of the period, identifying themselves as the daughters of Mother Jones and other great labor organizers of the past. I was personally part of such a dramatic episode of women's history. In 1987, 20,000 Oregon State workers went on strike. It was not only the first strike of our union, it was a historic rolling strike. And while There were male workers, of course. It was predominantly female workforce, those not represented in the rank and file leadership of the union, that led the way. The central demand of the strike was pay equity for women workers by raising the wages of the lowest job classifications. In some ways, the changes in the women striking for the first time were the same as the men: increased class consciousness and new way of seeing the world. They saw the press and the Democratic governor in a brand new light. They created bonds with co-workers that have lasted to this day. But there was also a special dynamic between women workers who experienced their power through the strike. When the Democratic governor went to the press and said, "The state of Oregon is in chaos," the question is, can these workers roll through an agency, have us try to replace the staff, then bring people back again, displace our substitutes, and then go out again? How long can this continue? And women workers looked at each other and said, "We did this." After the strike was over, Michael Krivosh, who was the lead organizer and strategist of the strike, told women workers, "This is my mother's strike." As he was driving up the coast to check on the picket lines in the small towns, he said he noticed the picketing was very heavy and it was all women workers. It looked like the men had gone fishing, he said. "I think the strike was addictive to women who were experiencing their power for the first time. We could not imagine being anywhere else." In reading all about the Polish women's strike last year, one word kept coming up in all the interviews, saying the women of Poland were feeling empowered and it was thrusting them forward. The importance of taking the examples of the women of Argentina and Poland and Ireland and Iceland to the United States cannot be overrated. Feminists have seen their movement immobilized by electoral strategies tying women to the swamp of the Democratic Party. Our issues have been manipulated and used as fundraising ploys for private nonprofit foundations. Working class women have been pushed aside while self-proclaimed feminists decry the class ceiling of the corporate boardroom, while the unfulfilled demands of 24/7 daycare centers and reproductive justice lie dormant. As socialists, we see women rising up to build new feminist movement, moving to the streets based on class. An uncompromising movement that takes on the issues and struggles of women. An anti-capitalist movement that does not depend on legislatures and laws, but on our power to unite and force change. This is a movement that aligns us with every part of the struggle and will create leaders that will be part of breaking the hold of the labor bureaucracy on all the organizations of our struggle. 100 years ago, women Bolsheviks organized and were part of the first socialist revolution. On this 100th anniversary of that historic event, we should remember that on March 8, 1917, it was the first tens of thousands of women factory workers in Russia who took to the streets demanding an end to the Tsar. 7 days later, he resigned, and women were granted the right to vote. But they had, in fact, launched the first of two revolutions that would quickly and vividly demonstrate how the seizure of power by working people could almost immediately create many of the material conditions necessary to put women on the road to liberation. They began their work with the understanding that to liberate women, all the old repressive structures must be abolished and replaced with institutions that guarantee women economic freedom. Inessa Arman, director of the Women's Bureau, Russia, boldly proclaimed, "As long as the old forms of the compulsory family, restrictive home life, and child rearing are not abolished, it will be impossible to establish socialism." If you want to be part of building a feminist movement of the 99% linked internationally with the struggles of working women worldwide, take a look at my organization, Socialist Action. We plan to join with other anti-capitalist women to make this choice visible and accessible. Thank you.
Our third panelist is Tatiana Cozzarelli. She's from Left Voice, an editor of Left Voice, and there's issues here, and they're a co-sponsor of this forum. And she is also a member of Pani Rosas, which is based in Argentina and Brazil.
So, hi, like she said, my name is Tatiana. I'm an editor for Left Voice. I'm going to talk a little bit about Panirrosas, which is the organization that I was part of. It's a socialist women's organization. I was a part of it for several years in Brazil, but I also spent some time in Argentina, and we're larger in Argentina than in Brazil, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that organization and specifically how we sort of what our ideas are and how we're ingrained in the working class and how we were able to push for a strike on March 8th, sometimes successfully and sometimes not successfully at some workplaces, but so that's sort of what I'm going to try to do in this time. And there's going to be some videos too. So, all right. So, I mean, folks, thanks for both of your talks. I think they give a good context for what I want to talk about. So the March 8th mobilizations in Argentina were huge. There were thousands and thousands of folks on the streets. And of course, that didn't just fall from the sky, right? It builds on, in Argentina specifically, the Ni Una Menos movement, which translated means not one less or not one woman less, against the femicides. So Ni Una Menos is a phrase from a poem from a Mexican writer from Ciudad Juarez on the border, where the bosses, the government, the narcos are complicit in a system of femicides for a lot of women who work in the maquilas. Of course, femicide exists outside of that as well. And femicide obviously is not specific to Mexico, and soon the poem that she wrote became famous, and soon Argentine feminists took up the slogan after there were several femicides. And in 2015, 300,000 women and men came to protest under the slogan Ni Una Menos. Came to protest the femicides under that slogan. And so since then, every year, there have been these Ni Una Menos protests where hundreds of thousands of people come out in support of women's rights. In fact, there's a Ni Una Menos protest happening as we speak in Argentina. Today is the day. So yeah, if folks want to take a picture and support later, we should do that. But anyway, and importantly, we in Panirrosas think of femicides as the last link in a very long chain of institutional violence that's legitimized and reproduced by the state, right? And we see that, of course, when a woman is a victim of some kind of sexist violence, she's then re-victimized by the state, by the cops who don't believe her, by the judges who don't believe her, who say it's her fault, and all of those things. That, along with the institutional violence of poverty and of capitalism. In Argentina specifically, the right to there's no right to legal abortion, and hundreds of women die each year having illegal and unsafe abortions. In fact, just last year there was a woman who had an abortion, and she was put in jail for 2 years because she had an abortion, and she was just released as a result of massive mobilizations by women to free her. So in the video that we'll see in a little bit, there's some folks talking about it. Her name is Belén. So she was released as a result of those mobilizations. So Ni Una Menos is very much part of the context for the massive March 8th strike mobilizations, and it went along with the strike. In Argentina, there were work stoppages on March 8th, in addition to the massive protest. At PepsiCo, a Pepsi factory, the work stoppage began at 5 a.m. And went on throughout the day. And it was they were able to stop based on a vote in a workers' assembly called by the shop floor council, and that the council is an opposition group to the union bureaucracy, and they were able to vote for a strike. Also, airline workers, predominantly women, also called for a strike on that day and created chaos in the Argentine airport because they were able to stop check-in services, and again, bolstered by assemblies organized by an opposition caucus to the union bureaucracy. Teachers also engaged in a massive protest. In the 2 days before March 8th, there had been a teacher's strike, a national teacher's work stoppage, and so what some folks were able to do was push the union to just extend the strike one more day in recognition of March 8th, an International Women's Strike. And Pan y Rosas, which in English means bread and roses, which is the group I'm part of, formed part of those oppositional caucuses in those spaces and was central in advocating for these kinds of work stoppages. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about Pan y Rosas and who we are and what we do. And for that, I'm going to show a video to start off. Hopefully this works. Just so you know, the first part of the video, the first person who speaks, she was a vice presidential candidate. She's a human rights lawyer who was integral in trying to lock up a lot of the genocidal military people who had been, who tortured and killed people during the military dictatorship. So let's see if this works.
Estamos en esta movilización nuevamente multitudinaria por nuestros derechos. Un 8 de marzo diciendo que no queremos ni una menos, diciendo viva nos queremos, por el derecho al aborto legal, seguro y gratuito que nos fue negado en el gobierno anterior, que nos está siendo negado bajo este gobierno, y por la igualdad de derechos, por la equiparación salarial, porque en un momento de crisis capitalista las mujeres son las que más sufren esa crisis, y por eso estamos exigiendo que las centrales sindicales llamen a un paro por nuestras demandas. Es muy grave la situación que vivimos, una muerte cada 18 horas. Creo que eso necesita respuestas contundentes. Venimos centenas de docentes, no solo en defensa de la escuela pública, sino también por nuestros derechos como mujer trabajadora, exigiendo educación sexual, licencias para casos de violencia de género, y nos movilizamos exigiendo a las centrales sindicales un paro nacional para pararle la mano a Macri y a Vidal.
Desde Pan y Rosas, yo como trabajadora estatal, trabajadora del INDEC, dentro de lo que es nuestro sindicato, impulsamos para que sea efectivo ese paro. Hicimos asambleas, llevamos mandatos a los plenarios seccionales y por lo menos acá en Ate Capital logramos que haya paro todo el día, porque queríamos que justamente ese paro sea efectivo, si no, no hay otra manera que la tierra tiemble. Un paro efectivo y un paro con nuestros compañeros varones.
En la última década, 3.000 mujeres murieron por abortos clandestinos, por el aborto legal, libre, seguro y gratuito realizado en los hospitales públicos y por la violación inmediata de la condena Belén.
Para enfrentar todo tipo de violencia y ni una menos por femicidio.
Apoyemos la ley por licencia laboral por violencia de género a todas las trabajadoras estatales.
Desde las precarizadas, todo lo que venimos pasando, o sea, que no tenemos ningún derecho, que no lo tuvimos ni con el kirchnerismo ni tampoco con el macrismo, que no queda otra que organizarse y pelear por nuestros derechos, que nadie nos va a regalar nada. Por eso viajamos con una delegación, y lo bueno es que hay comisiones de mujeres en todos lados. Con Pan y Rosas vivimos, y la verdad que impresionante la columna, lleno de gente, lleno de mujeres luchando, y eso es lo que nos va a fortalecer.
Se necesita fuerza para luchar, se necesita energía para luchar, se necesita coraje para luchar, pero se necesita ser muy consciente y una organización como un partido revolucionario para poder triunfar. Y alguna vez los explotados y las explotadas, los oprimidos, queremos triunfar. Nuestra lucha es por levantarnos, todos los esclavos, las esclavas de este sistema, y acabar una vez por todas con este sistema, y levantemos por fin el grito de cuando sentimos heredera, el grito de todas las mujeres que han luchado en toda la historia de la humanidad, por el socialismo, por el internacionalismo, por el pan y por las rosas. Gracias.
to continue. So that's a little bit about who we are as Panirrosas. So Panirrosas, like I said, is a socialist women's group. We exist in Argentina, but also in Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Mexico, Spain, Germany, and other countries. And we're grounded in a firm belief that only in ending this system of capitalist misery can we bring an end to sexism that plagues the lives of women around the world. With that said, we also fight for immediate democratic changes and fight for women's rights in the here and now. We fight for the right to an abortion. We fight for the right to be paid a living wage and to be paid equal to men. We fight for the right to not be beaten, raped, and abused. But we do that with the full knowledge that real liberation for women isn't possible in capitalism. So we also organize for socialist revolution. And we believe that the working class is the revolutionary subject, the group that can make this whole system fall apart, because it's the group that makes the whole system move. But we also believe that the working class united with the women's movement and taking up the demands of women, LGBT people, Black people, indigenous people, that alliance is an unstoppable force in our society. And so that's how theoretically our basis, and that's how we organize. We seek to be the socialist wing of a broader Argentine women's movement. So sort of we exist within Ni Una Menos. So we go to Ni Una Menos with this idea of socialist revolution. And so, if you want to know more about what Panirrosas is about, we have an international manifesto that we came out with, so you all are welcome to read it. Panirrosas was formed by militants of a Trotskyist political party, the PTS, Partido de Trabajadores Socialistas, the Party of Socialist Workers. And at the time, in 2001, they were writing a book called Panirrosas, Bread and Roses. And 2001 was a moment of intense capitalist crisis in Argentina. There were massive mobilizations against unemployment. There was an unemployed workers movement called Piqueteros. There was massive inflation, massive government instability. Also in that moment, the militants of the PTS were very inspired by a factory called Bruckmann, which was a factory where most of the workers were women, and the women took over the factory because it was supposed to close down, and they camped out in the factory, and then they were like, we can just keep producing. Yeah. So the cops came and tried to kick them out several times. They suffered a lot of repression. The PTS was always on the front lines of helping to defend them, along with other political parties who were there. Also in 2002, the PTS was involved in the takeover by the workers of Zanon, which is a ceramics factory that some folks might have heard of. Zanon, when it was taken over, the workers organized a women's commission within the factory, organizing women workers as well as the partners of the male workers in the factories. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a little bit, but Bruckmann and Zanon were part of this wave of factory takeovers and of intense workers' mobilizations. And Panirrosas sort of was born of addressing women's issues within that as well. And also the other thing that started to happen in Argentina is that there's a national conference for women that brings together thousands and thousands and thousands of women every year. So Panirrosas, as soon as we started going to those conferences and connecting with women and feminists from all over the country. The first time we went in 2003, we were 40 women. In the video, there's a shot where you can see all of the sea of purple. So that's us. That this last 2016 encuentro, we were 4,000 women. So from all over Argentina that came together for the encuentro. And like I said, we try to be a revolutionary socialist wing within the broader women's movement. And of course, also, Panirrosas gets its name from the Bread and Roses strike, 1912 in Lawrence, Massachusetts, where women organized a strike to protest wage cuts, and we find the demands for bread and roses to be a really powerful one, right? We demand our rights as workers for increase in wages, less working hours, et cetera. We demand our rights as women. We demand the right to childcare, the right to an abortion, the right to not be harassed in the street. And we also demand the right to leisure. We demand the right to spend time with our families, to create art, and to live a full life, the right to bread and the right to roses. And so that's where the name comes from. And Pan y Rosas is an organization that includes militants of the PTS, the Socialist Party I was talking about, as well as people who are not organized in the PTS. And so it's organized that way. It's a group of women, but we constantly try to make connections with our male comrades in workplaces and universities, and I'll talk a little more about that later. And importantly, we reject trans-exclusionary feminism. We fight for the rights of trans women. We include trans women. In fact, in Brazil, in Pan y Rosas, one of the main leaders is a trans woman. So I wanted to also make that clear, because sometimes people think some crazy stuff. Anyway, so I want to talk a little bit now about our engagement in the working class and this idea of women's commissions. So Pan y Rosas seeks to create women's commissions in factories and workplaces around the country. And they include women workers, but also spouses, daughters, mothers, and so forth. And these commissions aren't they weren't our idea. They date back to IWW strikes, and they serve the purpose of helping women participate in labor struggles, get politicized around labor issues, but also around women's issues. And they also help women connect with other folks who are engaged in labor struggles. It's meant to break with the isolation that many women feel at home, engaging in domestic work alone or with very little help, and also bring those problems into a collective space, seeking to remove women's work from the home and bringing it to the public sphere where it can be addressed in a socialized manner. So I want to give some examples of what these women's commissions have been able to do. So for example, at the Kraft Foods factory, there was a women's commission, and they helped organize a work stoppage after a female worker had been harassed by her manager. So she had been sexually harassed by her manager. She goes to, she sort of followed all of the channels that were necessary, the bureaucratic things within the factory, and what ends up happening is she gets suspended and the manager stays. And so immediately she goes to the Women's Commission, she goes to the oppositional caucus within the factory, and right away they say, okay, this is not going to happen, and they organize a work stoppage right away. They're like, okay, and we're done, no more producing. Within 5 hours, the manager had been removed and she had been reinstated. So that's sort of the power of this kind of organizing. I also want to give the example of Donnelly's, which is now a worker-controlled factory called Madigraf. And it came under workers' control in 2014. And women and the Women's Commission were a central part of supporting the initiative for working control, participating in pickets, seeking community support, like helping get support for this factory. And now that this factory is under workers' control, they run a daycare center out of the factory, that works from 5 a.m. to 10 p.m. And it's one of the few factories that has a child care center there. And of course, these workers attend the Ni Una Menos protest, attended the March 8th protest, and they've also organized workshops within the factory for the male workers to talk about sexism and machismo among men. Also, importantly, within the PTS, we don't think that only Pan y Rosas or only women should be discussing sexism, even though we do have Pan y Rosas that takes up these issues. And I want to give another example of that from this worker-controlled factory, Madigraf. So before it was under workers' control, like many years before, when it was under the control of, the capitalist boss. They didn't hire, they had a men-only policy in who they hired. Of course, that's not true when it's under worker control. But what ends up happening is that one of the workers in this factory came out as a trans woman. And the manager and the bosses were obviously assholes about it, and they wanted to force her to continue to use the men's restroom and locker room. And so the workers at Mardi Gras, years before they take it under workers' control, organized a work stoppage to defend her right to use the women's restroom. And I think that struggle helped lead to strengthening the workers of Mardi Gras to feel like they could put the factory under their own control, like they could respond and give a better response, obviously, than the bosses to the issues within the factory. And then the last thing I want to talk about is because, like I said, Pan y Rosas is connected to the PTS, the political party I'm talking about, and we run in elections. We're part of a coalition of 3 parties called the Left and Workers Front, which is called the FIT. And we run in elections not because we think it's like the way to socialism. We don't think you can elect your way to socialism. But we do think it's a platform for us to reach millions of people. So we have 3 members in National Congress, dozens of people in state and local legislatures, and we use those seats to denounce the capitalist parties and to bring support and attention to the struggles of workers, youth, women, and also we use those seats particularly to address women's issues. Also importantly, all of our elected officials receive the same salary as a teacher, because we believe that all politicians should get the same salary as a teacher. So all of our elected officials receive the same salary as a teacher and donate the rest to different worker and community struggles. I want to show a quick commercial for one of our candidates. This is the person I've been telling you about before, who is a human rights lawyer. And as you'll see, our proposal is that we think workers should work shorter hours and everyone should be employed. So this is a commercial for us.
Te quiero contar por qué apoyo las propuestas de Miriam Bregman. Porque todos los días después de dejar a mi nena en la escuela me tengo que ir corriendo al trabajo. Soy empleada administrativa. Trabajo 9 horas de lunes a viernes y aunque llego recansada, me hago tiempo para estar con Juli. Y se nota que ellos no tienen que pagar el alquiler y los tarifazos con un sueldo que no alcanza. Por eso apoyo a la izquierda.
Las mujeres cobramos menos y ocupamos muchas más horas en el cuidado de los chicos y en la casa. Ustedes nos conocen, no estamos solos. Tenemos la fuerza organizada de miles de mujeres, de trabajadores, de jóvenes. Esa fuerza la podemos llevar al Congreso.
Basta de gobernar para los ricos. La izquierda propone trabajar 6 horas, 5 días a la semana con un sueldo igual a la canasta familiar.
And so the slogan for this campaign is "Our lives are worth more than their profits," which also connects to the Ni Una Menos campaign. Just very briefly to wrap up, in the last presidential election, we had a presidential candidate. Our candidate was the only one in the televised national debate to talk about women's rights and to talk about the right to an abortion. Even though there were women candidates on the stage, and none of them said anything about abortion. He said that women should have the right to an abortion, and that needs to happen now. We in our seats in Congress and in state and local legislatures, we put forward laws around women's rights. So, for example, an emergency plan for victims of domestic violence that's fully funded and gives women access to paid leave from their jobs, gives women access to housing, and things like that. So, just to wrap up, I think that often when we hear about other countries, It's easy for folks in the US to just say like, oh, that's like somewhere else and it's like impossible to do here because we're so behind and the unions are terrible and we don't have strikes. And all that's true, you know? It's true that the union bureaucracy is really strong in the US. It's true that the working class has been very defeated in the last decades. But I do want to end saying that it doesn't have to be that way. That, you know, the work of Pan y Rosas, like I said, we started out with 40 people, and it's been patient organizing work within the working class that allows the militants in the party to fuse with a broader rage and discontent in society that led to the work stoppages on March 8th. And so I think that, you know, organizing, understanding that we can't put faith in any of the capitalist parties, and we can't put faith in the capitalist state to defend our rights because we've seen that that strategy doesn't work, and that that instead we need to put our faith in organizing within the working class and organizing with a socialist and revolutionary perspective. And I think the March 8th strike is definitely a step in the right direction. And a step in the right direction in the sense of internationalism, in the sense of putting forward the idea of a strike. And I think it's central that we are internationalists coming from the imperialist country of the world, so that we can learn from other countries and learn from their examples. So I think that's it.
Thank you. Questions, discussion? Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. When you guys take over factories, is the goal to form workers cooperatives out of it, you know, or I'm not understanding the end game of that, especially when you talk about disrupting the capitalist system.
Absolutely. Do you want to do groups of questions?
Yeah,
Okay.
let's do that. Anybody else? Yes.
You know, when you're defining work in the market as exploitation, and you're defining work in the home as oppression, I have some questions, especially in a global sphere where we're seeing things in the 99% and we're more flexible, you know, about how we define exploitation, how that, you know, how that's coming about, if that's the best model.
Any others? Yes, go ahead.
I was at the March 8th Women's Strike gathering rally in Washington Square, and I was just was very impressed by the speakers and who came and who spoke, and it came off of the energy of the Women's March in DC too. I think that's why a lot of people might come. And I just wanted to ask you what's your follow-up, what you thought, what you were going to build on. That's what I was
Okay, why don't we let the panelists respond to any and all?
Yeah, I can respond to some of them. I guess I'll go first. I think that the question of exploitation versus oppression is like a key one. And I have a very strong personal opinion, but I don't think that everyone in the International Women's Strike Committee nationally or even locally agrees with this. And these are like theoretical legacies that we're inheriting from a previous moment. Like in terms of the exploitation versus oppression question, I'm pretty clear on this, that I believe there's that racial and gender oppression are forms of class struggle, are forms of class exploitation, and that they come from the top down. We like negotiate them in various different ways through class struggle. But for example, in the work that I do around domestic workers from Latin America, for example, a lot of them sometimes have college degrees where they come from. And the second they enter the United States, because of their status as immigrant women workers who are Mexican or Central American or whatever, they automatically enter into a certain already pre-existing hierarchy of labor in the United States where they're gonna be funneled into domestic work, or they're gonna be funneled into elderly care, child care, nannying, housekeeping kind of things, and that's not necessarily where we're all coming from. There's a pretty substantive group of people that believes that patriarchy is an independent system that's transhistorical. There's always been oppression of women. There always will be oppression of women, and that you need to fight the patriarchy, and then you end up kind of sometimes allying with people like Hillary Clinton and boss feminists, because you're like, yeah, there's capitalism, but that's a separate question from patriarchy, and like we need to, and yeah, I mean, I would hope that you like, it's disgusting when people attack Hillary Clinton on the basis of her gender, because there's other important things to critique her about other than not her gender. And so yeah, there is that dynamic, but for me, gender and race are not transhistorical categories that have always existed, that will always exist in the same ways, and we negotiate those in different ways, and people will disagree with me, and even within International Women's Strike, there's people that disagree, but that's where I'm coming to it.
Can I clarify my question?
Sure, yeah.
Because I think, there was, I still am old-fashioned. I don't think modes of production is so unreal.
That what?
That modes of production from us is so unreal. I think there's still some value to looking at the different forms that exploitation has taken over the centuries before capitalism. And I guess when I look at the work done in the home, it seems to me kind of like the imperialist way we use resources from other countries, the informal sectors, the subcontractors everywhere, and it's sort of that kind of a model where those resources are being indirectly creating traditional capitalist profit, in the wage labor sector of the country. And I feel like in the same way, women's labor in the home, we're reproducing for free the working class, and that indirectly, just kind of like a subcontractor or something else, is really part of the regular exploitation of labor under capitalism. It's haven't been subsumed under capitalism.
Yeah, so then you're talking about a super important question that I deal with in my work too, actually. So like, there's the extreme end of this. There's the extreme end of that camp, which is the wages for housework, that says.
Yeah, that would be different. Yeah.
But the wages for housework says that, right? The wages for housework campaign says that women workers or workers who do reproductive labor are producing a commodity and producing value for capital. And like when you get a raw piece of meat, you have to then valorize it in the MCM prime, yada yada. It's like really subsumed, yada yada. And I don't think that that's true, actually. I think that they're like, it's combined and uneven development of different kind of.
It's also an individual solution, because
we have to.
They're suggesting a capitalist response, just like the basic thing.
Yeah, I'm just trying to draw out like that there's different. I think it's important to say that there are different camps, and there are going to be people who think that there's it runs the gamut from people who think that women's work is actually subsumed fully in the house. There are people who think that there are some industries that are really subsumed, and like increasingly number of industries, right? Like now you can pay for, like there's apps where you can pay for someone to hang out with you, kind of thing. Like, and that kind of care is like really commodified, but there's other kinds of care that's not commodified. And then there are people who are like, no, those are two completely different spheres of production and reproduction that never touch at all. And we haven't, I don't think, figured that out. Although I have a pretty strong opinion about it, but that's irrelevant at this point.
Your opinion's irrelevant?
No, I mean,
No, we want to know your opinion.
not that my opinion's irrelevant, but that I think that we're gonna find out those answers through struggle and not through abstract conversations about whether, okay, I'll give you an example. So the work that I do is around immigrant women, domestic workers. The model that they use for organizing comes from this model of immigrant day laborers, right? So before they started organizing as a group of day laborers or domestic workers, right? They're socially isolated so that the work that they do isn't in conversation with one another. In that instance, yeah, it's not public, it's private, it's not taking place on the market, you're not exchanging money for it. The second that a bunch of people get together as day laborers and start saying, you know, we're going to have our bottom lines, we're going to demand that every day laborer get paid at least $15 an hour, that there's like a contract that they each have to negotiate with the person that hires them, then they're no longer socially isolated. And you see the same thing happening with domestic workers, except, you know, I have a critique of the fact that a lot of them are being organized through like nonprofits that are, quite frankly, pretty neoliberal. So there's a limit to how much they can demand a fair wage and working conditions and et cetera, et cetera. So for me to sit here and say like all workers are really subsumed, some are, it's totally uneven and combined, and my hope is that we'll figure out what the answer is. And I don't even think actually that when they are really subsumed, that it is public and it's all on the market and everybody becomes a worker, then everything's going to be great. No, because then you still have to like agitate for the abolition of work on the market as it exists, and that's going to be another completely different question when we get to it. So it's not that my opinion doesn't matter, it's that
it's part of the collective, but it's isolated from the collective. We got you.
That we can't have abstract conversations about it, although we can have an orientation, and I certainly do have an orientation.
I was just expressing that I was curious.
Thanks.
Well, as somebody, there was a long desert. We had these discussions, and then we didn't for the longest time. So the wonderful thing about this moment is that we're having these discussions again, and as Maga suggested, through struggle, we're going to be sharpening and developing theory in a whole new way.
Can I say something just real quick?
Yes.
This is in the concrete. So if any of you were interested about the concept of a rolling strike, there was a lot more to it than just what I talked about. And so I did write an article called 9 Days at Shook Oregon. I have paper copies, or you can go to laborstandard.org and go to under labor history and read it. It's not very long, but it gives you a feel of what that kind of a strike was like, and maybe you'll be motivated to want to do one in your own place before it's outlawed or after it's outlawed.
I want to take the question about co-ops and the issue of worker-controlled factories. Often these worker-controlled factories come about because the bosses are like, all right, we're shutting down the factory, everyone lost their job. And the workers say, no, actually we're going to stay here and we're going to keep producing. And so many of them came about in that way. And our position as, the PTS is that, co-ops aren't like a revolutionary solution to capitalism. Some people would say like you just like keep building a parallel economy to capitalism, and then eventually that capitalism will end or something. And we don't think that. With that said, so our position in terms of the worker-controlled factories is that we want them to continue to be under worker control, meaning all decisions about production are made by the workers, but we want them to be state-owned, to be owned by the government. And the reason we want that is we've seen examples how, for example, Zanon, the factory, one of the most famous worker-controlled factories, is not state-owned. It's owned by the workers as a co-op. And to be honest, it's not doing very well economically because all of these other factories get subsidies from the government, they get help from the government, and Zanon doesn't. And as a result, they're doing, economically, they have a really hard time surviving next to this monster of the capitalist system. And they really can't compete. So at Mardi Gras, which is, we've always put forward this idea of state-owned, worker-controlled factories. At Mardi Gras, which is the printing company that I talked about, they had the strike for the trans worker. We were able to get it to be state-owned. There was a law that just passed it through the Congress like maybe a month ago. So it's state-owned and under worker control. So that's sort of what we want from those places, and also we want those places to be examples for the rest of the working class that the working class can